The Lost World by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Chapter 15. Our Eyes Have Seen Great Wonders. I write this from day to day, but I trust that before I come to the end of it, I may be able to say that the light shines at last through the clouds. We are held here with no clear means of making our escape, and bitterly we chafe against it, yet I can well imagine that the day may come when we may be glad that we were kept against our will, to see something more of the wonders of this singular place, and of the creatures who inhabit it. The victory of the Indians and the annihilation of the ape-men marked the turning point of our fortunes. From then onwards we were in truth masters of the plateau, for the natives looked upon us with a mixture of fear and gratitude, since by our strange powers we had aided them to destroy their hereditary foe. We had returned across the plateau with our allies 2 days after the battle, and made our camp at the foot of their cliffs. They would have had us share their caves with them, but Lord John would by no means consent to it, considering that to do so would put us in their power if they were treacherously disposed. We kept our independence, therefore, and had our weapons ready for any emergency, while preserving the most friendly relations. We also continually visited their caves, which were most remarkable places, though whether made by man or by nature we have never been able to determine. Some day, when I have a better desk than a meat tin, and more helpful tools than a worn stub of pencil and a last tattered notebook, I will write some fuller account of the Akala Indians, of our life amongst them, and of the glimpses which we have had of the strange conditions of wondrous maple-white land. Memory, at least, will never fail me, for so long as the breath of life is in me, every hour and every action of that period will stand out as hard and clear as do the first strange happenings of our childhood. No new impressions could efface those which are so deeply cut. That said, there was not one of our party who were not intent on devising some means by which we could return to the outer world. Our work had, however, been in vain. There had been, so far as we could follow our Indian host's signs, a tunnel by which the place could be approached, the lower exit of which we had seen from below. By this, no doubt, both ape-men and Indians had at different epochs reached the top, and Maplewhite, with his companion, had taken the same way. Only the year before, however, there had been a terrific earthquake, and the upper end of the tunnel had fallen in and completely disappeared. One other fact we had very speedily discovered. The Indians would do nothing to help us in our efforts to leave the plateau. In every other way they were our friends, one might almost say our devoted slaves, but when it was suggested that they should help us to make and carry a plank which would bridge the chasm, or when we wished to get from them thongs of leather or liana to weave ropes which might help us, we were met with a good-humoured but an invincible refusal. Ever since their crowning triumph with the ape-men, they looked upon us as supermen who bore victory in tubes of strange weapons, and they believed that so long as we remained with them, good fortune would be theirs. So far all had been kindly, however far apart our desires might be, but we felt well assured that our actual plans of a descent must be kept secret, for we had reason to fear that at the last they might try and hold us by force. In spite of the danger from dinosaurs, I have twice in the last 3 weeks been over to our old camp in order to see the Herculean Zambo, who still kept watch and ward below the cliff. My eyes strained in vain across the great plain in the hope of seeing afar off the help for which we had prayed. I had a strange experience as I came from my second visit, which had involved my being away for a night from my companions. I was returning along the well-remembered route, and had reached a spot within a mile or so of the marsh of the pterodactyls, when I saw an extraordinary object approaching me. It was a man who walked inside a framework made of bent canes, so that he was enclosed on all sides in a bell-shaped cage. As I drew nearer, I was more amazed to see that it was Lord John Roxton. When he saw me, he slipped from under his curious protection, and came towards me laughing, and yet, as I thought, with some confusion in his manner. "Well, young fellow," said he, "who would have thought of meeting you up here?" "What in the world are you doing?" I asked. "Visiting my friends the pterodactyls," said he. "But why?" "Interesting beasts, don't you think? But unsociable. Nasty rude ways with strangers, as you may remember, so I rigged this framework which keeps them from being too pressing in their attentions. I'm going to get a young devil chick for Challenger. No, I don't want your company. I'm safe in this cage, and you are not. So long, and I'll be back in camp by nightfall." He turned away, and I left him wandering on through the wood with his extraordinary cage around him. If Lord John's behaviour at this time was strange, that of Challenger was more so. I may say that he seemed to possess an extraordinary fascination for the Indian women, and that he always carried a large spreading palm branch with which he beat them off as if they were flies when their attentions became too pressing. To see him walking like a comic opera sultan, his black beard bristling in front of him, and a train of wide-eyed Indian girls behind him, is one of the most grotesque of all pictures which I will carry back with me. Challenger had been in the habit of walking off by himself every morning, and returning from time to time with looks of portentous solemnity, as one who bears the full weight of a great enterprise upon his shoulders. One day, palm branch in hand, and his crowd of adoring devotees behind him, he led us down to his hidden workshop, and took us into the secret of his plans. The place was a small clearing in the centre of a palm grove. In this was one of those boiling mud geysers which I have already described. Around its edge were scattered a number of leather thongs cut from iguanodon hide, and a large collapsed membrane, which proved to be the dried and scraped stomach of one of the great fish lizards from the lake, sewn up at one end, and with a small orifice left at the other. Into this opening several bamboo canes had been inserted, and the other ends of these canes were in contact with conical clay funnels which collected the gas bubbling up through the mud of the geyser. Soon the flaccid organ began to slowly expand, and show such a tendency to upward movements that Challenger fastened the cords which held it to the trunks of the surrounding trees. In half an hour a good-sized gas bag had been formed, and the jerking and straining upon the thongs showed that it was capable of considerable lift. Challenger, like a glad father in the presence of his firstborn, stood smiling and stroking his beard, in silent, self-satisfied content, as he gazed at the creation of his brain. It was Summerlee who broke the silence. "You don't mean to go up in that thing, Challenger?" said he, in an acid voice. "I mean, my dear Summerlee, to give you such a demonstration of its powers that after seeing it you will, I am sure, have no hesitation in trusting yourself to it." "You may put it right out of your head now, at once," said Summerlee with decision. "Nothing on earth would induce me to commit such a folly. Lord John, I trust that you will not countenance such madness." "Deuced ingenious, I call it," said our peer. "I'd like to see how it works." "So you shall," said Challenger. "For some days I have exerted my whole brain force upon the problem of how we shall descend from these cliffs. We have satisfied ourselves that we cannot climb down, and that there is no tunnel. We are also unable to construct any kind of bridge which may take us back to the pinnacle from which we came. How, then, shall I find a means to convey us? Some little time ago I had remarked to our young friend here that free hydrogen has evolved from the geyser. The idea of a balloon naturally followed. I was, I will admit, somewhat baffled by the difficulty of discovering an envelope to contain the gas, but the contemplation of the immense entrails of these reptiles supplied me with a solution to the problem. Behold the result." "Midsummer madness," snorted Summerlee. Lord John was delighted with the whole idea. "Clever old dear, ain't he?" he whispered to me, and then louder to Challenger. "What about a car?" "The car will be my next care. I have already planned how it is to be made and attached. Meanwhile, I will simply show you how capable my apparatus is of supporting the weight of each of us." "All of us, surely?" "No. It is part of my plan that each in turn shall descend as in a parachute, and the balloon be drawn back by means which I shall have no difficulty in perfecting. If it will support the weight of one and let him down gently, it will have done all that is required of it. I will now show you its capacity in that direction." He brought out a lump of basalt of considerable size, constructed in the middle so that a cord could be easily attached to it. This cord was the one which we had brought with us onto the plateau after we had used it for climbing the pinnacle. It was over 100 feet long, and though it was thin, it was very strong. He had prepared a sort of collar of leather with many straps depending from it. This collar was placed over the dome of the balloon, and the hanging thongs were gathered together below, so that the pressure of any weight would be diffused over a considerable surface. Then the lump of basalt was fastened to the thongs, and the rope was allowed to hang from the end of it, being passed 3 times round the professor's arm. "I will now," said Challenger, with a smile of pleased anticipation, "demonstrate the carrying power of my balloon." As he said so, he cut with a knife the various lashings that held it. Never was our expedition in more imminent danger of complete annihilation. The inflated membrane shot up with frightful velocity into the air. In an instant, Challenger was pulled off his feet and dragged after it. I had just time to throw my arms round his ascending waist when I was whipped up into the air. Lord John had me with a rat-trap grip around the legs, but I felt that he also was coming off the ground. For a moment I had a vision of 4 adventurers floating like a string of sausages over the land that they had explored. But happily there were limits to the strain which the rope would stand, though none apparently to the lifting powers of this infernal machine. There was a sharp crack, and we were in a heap upon the ground, with coils of rope all over us. When we were able to stagger to our feet, we saw far off in the deep blue sky one dark spot where the lump of basalt was speeding upon its way. "Splendid!" cried the undaunted Challenger, rubbing his injured arm. "A most thorough and satisfactory demonstration. I could not have anticipated such a success. Within a week, gentlemen, I promise you that a second balloon will be prepared, and that you can count upon taking in safety and comfort the first stage of our homeward journey." So far I have written each of the foregoing events as it occurred. Now I am rounding off my narrative from the old camp, where Zambo has waited so long, with all our difficulties and dangers left like a dream behind us upon the summit of those vast ruddy crags which tower above our heads. We have descended in safety, though in a most unexpected fashion, and all is well with us. In 6 weeks or 2 months we shall be in London, and it is possible that this letter may not reach you much earlier than we do ourselves. Already our hearts yearn and our spirits fly towards the great mother city which holds so much that is dear to us. It was on the very evening of our perilous adventure with Challenger's home-made balloon that the change came in our fortune. One person from whom we had some sign of sympathy in our attempts to get away was the young chief whom we had rescued. That evening after dusk he came down to our little camp, handed me a small roll of the bark of a tree, and then, pointing solemnly up at the row of caves above him, he had put his finger to his lips as a sign of secrecy, and had stolen back again to his people. I took the slip of bark to the firelight, and we examined it together. It was about a foot square, and on the inner side there was a singular arrangement of lines neatly done in charcoal upon the white surface, that looked to me at first sight like some sort of rough musical score. "Whatever it is, I can swear that it is of importance to us," said I. I could read that on his face as he gave it. "It is clearly some sort of script," said Challenger. "Looks like a guinea puzzle competition," remarked Lord John, craning his neck to have a look at it. Then suddenly he stretched out his hand and seized the puzzle. "By George!" he cried. "I believe I've got it. See here. How many marks are there on that paper? 18. Well, if you come to think of it, there are 18 cave openings on the hillside above us." "He pointed up to the caves when he gave it to me," said I. "Well, that settles it. This is a chart of the caves, and here's a cross on it. What's the cross for? It is placed to mark one that is much deeper than the others." "One that goes through," I cried. "But if the cave goes through," said Challenger, "and comes out at the corresponding point on the other side, we should not have more than 100 feet to descend." 100 feet? grumbled Summerlee. "Well, our rope is still more than 100 feet long," I cried. "Surely we could get down." "How about the Indians in the cave?" Summerlee objected. "There are no Indians in any of the caves above our heads," said I. "They are all used as barns and storehouses. Why should we not go up now at once and spy out the land?" There is a dry bituminous wood upon the plateau which is used by the Indians for torches. Each of us picked up a faggot of this, and we made our way up to the particular cave which was marked in the drawing. As we had no desire to draw the attentions of the Indians to our proceedings, we stumbled along in the dark until we had gone round several curves and penetrated a considerable distance into the cavern. Then at last we lit our torches. It was a beautiful dry tunnel with smooth grey walls covered with native symbols, a curved roof which arched over our heads, and white glistening sand beneath our feet. Along it we hurried in breathless anticipation for many hundreds of yards. Then suddenly, in the black darkness of the arch in front of us, we saw a gleam of dark red light. We stared in amazement. A sheet of steady flame seemed to cross the passage and to bar our way. We hastened towards it. No sound, no heat, no movement came from it, but still the great luminous curtain glowed before us, silvering all the cave and turning the sand to powdered jewels, until as we drew closer it discovered a circular edge. "The moon, by George!" cried Lord John. "We're through, boys, we're through!" It was indeed the full moon, which shone straight down the aperture which opened upon the cliffs. It was a small rift, no larger than a window, but it was enough for all our purposes. As we craned our necks through it, we could see that the descent was not a very difficult one, and that the level ground was no very great distance below us. It was no wonder that from below we had not observed the place, as the cliffs curved overhead, and an ascent at that spot would have seemed so impossible as to discourage close inspection. We satisfied ourselves that with the help of our rope we could find our way down, and then returned rejoicing to our camp to make our preparations for the next evening. What we did we had to do quickly and secretly, since even at this late hour the Indians might hold us back. Our stores we would leave behind us, save only our guns and cartridges, but Challenger had some unwieldy stuff which he ardently desired to take with him, and one particular package, of which I may not speak, which gave us more labour than any. When the darkness fell we were ready for our departure. With much labour we got our things up the steps, and then, looking back, took one last long survey of that strange land, a land where we had dared so much, suffered much, and learned much. Even as we looked, a high whickering cry, the call of some weird animal, rang clear out of the darkness. It was the very voice of Maplewhite Land, bidding us good-bye. We turned and plunged into the cave, which led to home. 2 hours later, we, our packages, and all we owned were at the foot of the cliff. Save for Challenger's luggage, we had never a difficulty. Leaving it all where we descended, we started at once for Zambo's camp. In the early morning we approached it, but only to find, to our amazement, not one fire, but a dozen upon the plain. The rescue party had arrived. There were 20 Indians from the river, with stakes, ropes, and all that could be useful for bridging the chasm. At least we shall have no difficulty now in carrying our packages, when tomorrow we begin to make our way back to the Amazon. And so, in humble and thankful mood, I close this account. Our eyes have seen great wonders, and our souls are chastened by what we have endured. Each is, in his own way, a better and deeper man. It may be that when we reach Para, we shall stop to refit. If we do, this letter will be a mail ahead. If not, it will reach London on the very day that I do. In either case, my dear McArdle, I hope very soon to shake you by the hand. Chapter 16. A procession! A procession! And now I turn to the last supreme eventful moment of our adventure, the events of the meeting of the Zoological Institute that took place upon our return to the shores of England. As I was racking my brains as to how I should best describe it, my eyes fell upon the issue of my own journal for the morning of the 8th of November, with the full and excellent account of my friend and fellow reporter Macdonough. What can I do better than transcribe his narrative, headlines and all? Thus, then, friend Mac in his report. The New World, great meeting at the Queen's Hall. Scenes of uproar, extraordinary incident. What was it? Nocturnal riot in Regent Street. Special. The much-discussed meeting of the Zoological Institute convened to hear the report of the Committee of Investigation sent out last year to South America to test the assertions made by Professor Challenger as to the continued existence of prehistoric life upon that continent was held last night in the Greater Queen's Hall, and it is safe to say that it is likely to be a red-letter day in the history of science, for the proceedings were of so remarkable and sensational a character that no one present is ever likely to forget them. The tickets were, theoretically, confined to the members and their friends, but the latter is an elastic term, and long before 8 o'clock, the hour fixed for the commencement of the proceedings, all parts of the great hall were tightly packed. The entrance of the 4 heroes of the occasion was the signal for a remarkable demonstration of welcome, the whole audience rising and cheering for some minutes. An acute observer might, however, have detected some signs of dissent amid the applause, and gathered that the proceedings were likely to become more lively than harmonious. It may safely be prophesied, however, that no one could have foreseen the extraordinary turn which they were actually to take. When quiet had been restored, the chairman, the Duke of Durham, addressed the meeting. He would not, he said, stand for more than a moment between that vast assembly and the treat which lay before them. It was not for him to anticipate what Professor Summerlee, who was the spokesman of the committee, had to say to them, but it was common rumour that their expedition had been crowned by extraordinary success. He would only add before he sat down that he rejoiced, and all of them would rejoice, that these gentlemen had returned safe and sound from their difficult and dangerous task. Professor Summerlee's rising was the signal for another extraordinary outbreak of enthusiasm, which broke out again at intervals throughout his address. Having described the genesis of their journey and paid a handsome tribute to his friend Professor Challenger, coupled with an apology for the incredulity with which his assertions, now fully vindicated, had been received, he gave the actual course of their journey, carefully withholding such information as would aid the public in any attempt to locate and ascend to this remarkable plateau. The professor proceeded to describe both the horrors and the attractions of that remarkable land. Of personal adventures he said little, but laid stress upon the rich harvest reaped by science in the observations of the wonderful beast, bird, insect, and plant life of the plateau. It was, however, in the larger animals, and especially in the larger animals supposed to have been long extinct, that the interest of the public was naturally centered. He confirmed that the plateau was very rich in known prehistoric forms, dating back in some cases to early Jurassic times. Among these he mentioned the gigantic and grotesque Stegosaurus, seen once by Mr. Malone at a drinking place by the lake, and drawn in the sketchbook of that adventurous American who had first penetrated this unknown world. He described also the iguanodon and the pterodactyl, two of the first of the wonders which they had encountered. He then thrilled the assembly by some account of the terrible carnivorous dinosaurs which had on more than one occasion pursued members of the party, and which were the most formidable of all the creatures which they had encountered. Next he touched upon the Indians and upon the extraordinary colony of anthropoid apes. Finally, he described amongst some merriment the ingenious but highly dangerous aeronautic invention of Professor Challenger, and wound up a most memorable address by an account of the methods by which the committee did at last find their way back to civilization. It had been hoped that the proceedings would end there, and that a vote of thanks and congratulations, moved by Professor Sergius of Uppsala University, would be duly seconded and carried. But it was soon evident that the course of evidence was not destined to flow so smoothly. Symptoms of opposition had been evident from time to time during the evening, and now Dr. James Illingworth of Edinburgh rose in the centre of the hall. Dr. Illingworth asked whether an amendment should not be taken before a resolution. It was clear from the moment of his rising that Dr. Illingworth had a number of friends and sympathizers in the hall, though they formed a minority in the audience. The attitude of the greater part of the public might be described as one of attentive neutrality. Dr. Illingworth began by stating that his position, in fact, was substantially the same as that taken by Professor Summerlee at the last meeting. At that last meeting, Professor Challenger had made certain assertions which had been queried by his colleague. A year ago, one man said certain things. Now 4 men said other and more startling ones. Was this to constitute a final proof, where the matters in question were of the most revolutionary and incredible character? He admitted that the members of the committee were men of character, but human nature was very complex. Even professors might be misled by the desire for notoriety. Heavy game shots liked to be in a position to cap the tails of their rivals, and journalists were not averse from sensational coups, even when imagination had to aid fact in the process. Each member of the committee had his own motive for making the most of his results. He had no desire to be offensive, but the corroboration of these wondrous tales was really of the most slender description. What did it amount to? Some photographs. What more? We had a story of a flight, and a descent by ropes which precluded the production of larger specimens. It was ingenious, but not convincing. He moved, therefore, that while Professor Summerlee be thanked for his interesting address, the whole matter should be regarded as non-proven, and should be referred back to a larger and possibly more reliable committee of investigation. It is difficult to describe the uproar and confusion caused by this amendment. It was only the moderating influence of the presence of a large number of ladies which prevented an absolute riot. Suddenly, however, there was a pause, a hush, and then complete silence. Professor Challenger was on his feet. His appearance and manner are peculiarly arresting, and as he raised his hand for order, the whole audience settled down expectantly to give him a hearing. Professor Challenger asked Dr. Illingworth exactly what evidence of their discoveries he would accept as conclusive. Did he accuse them of having forged these photographs? He pointed out that the negatives were open to the inspection of experts. Dr. Illingworth responded by stating that no picture could convince him of anything. To be convinced, he would need to see one of these creatures himself. It was at this point that the sensation of the evening arose. Professor Challenger raised his hand in the air as a signal, and at once our colleague, Mr. E. D. Malone, was observed to rise and make his way to the back of the platform. An instant later he reappeared in the company of a gigantic assistant, the two of them bearing between them a large square packing case. It was evidently of great weight, and was slowly carried forward and placed in front of the professor's chair. All sound had hushed in the audience, and everyone was absorbed in the spectacle before them. Professor Challenger drew off the top of the case, which formed a sliding lid. Peering down into the box, he snapped his fingers several times, and was heard from the press seat to say, "Come then, pretty, pretty," in a coaxing voice. An instant later, with a scratching, rattling sound, a most horrible and loathsome creature appeared from below, and perched itself upon the side of the case. The face of the creature was like the wildest gargoyle that the imagination of a mad medieval builder could have conceived. There was a turmoil in the audience. Someone screamed, and two ladies in the front row fell senseless from their chairs. For a moment there was a danger of a general panic. Professor Challenger threw up his hands to still the commotion, but the movement alarmed the creature beside him. Its strange shawl suddenly unfurled, spread, and fluttered as a pair of leathery wings. Its owner grabbed at its legs, but too late to hold it. It had sprung from the perch, and was circling slowly round the Queen's Hall with a dry, leathery flapping of its 10-foot wings, while a putrid and insidious odour pervaded the room. The cries of the people in the galleries, who were alarmed at the near approach of those flowing eyes and that murderous beak, excited the creature to a frenzy. Faster and faster it flew, beating against the walls and chandeliers in a blind frenzy of alarm. "The window! For heaven's sake, shut that window!" roared the professor from the platform, dancing and wringing his hands in an agony of apprehension. Alas, his warning was too late. In a moment the creature, beating and bumping along the wall like a huge moth within a gas shade, came upon the opening, squeezed its hideous bulk through it, and was gone. Professor Challenger fell back into his chair with his face buried in his hands, while the audience gave one long, deep sigh of relief as they realized that the incident was over. Then, oh, how shall one describe what took place then? Then the full exuberance of the majority and the full reaction of the minority united to make one great wave of enthusiasm, which rolled from the back of the hall, gathering volume as it came, swept over the orchestra, submerged the platform, and carried the four heroes away upon its crest. They were held in their lofty places of honour. It would have been hard to let them down if it had been wished, so dense was the crowd round them. "Regent Street! Regent Street!" sounded the voices. There was a swirl in the packed multitude, and a slow current, bearing the four upon their shoulders, made for the door. Out in the street the scene was extraordinary. An assemblage of not less than 100,000 people was waiting. The close-packed throng extended from the other side of the Langham Hotel to Oxford Circus. A roar of acclamation greeted the four adventurers as they appeared, high above the heads of the people, under the vivid electric lamps outside the hall. "A procession! A procession!" was the cry. In a dense phalanx blocking the streets from side to side, the crowd set forth, taking the route of Regent Street, Pall Mall, St. James Street, and Piccadilly. Finally, it was not until after midnight that the four travellers were released at the entrance of Lord John Roxton's chambers in the Albany, and that the exuberant crowd, having sung "They Are Jolly Good Fellows" in chorus, concluded their programme with "God Save the King." So ended one of the most remarkable evenings that London has seen for a considerable time. One word as to the fate of the London pterodactyl. Nothing can be said to be certain upon this point. There is the evidence of two frightened women that it perched upon the roof of the Queen's Hall and remained there like a diabolical statue for some hours. The only other evidence which I can adduce is from the log of the SS Friesland, a Dutch-American liner, which asserts that at 9 next morning they were passed by something between a flying goat and a monstrous bat, which was heading at a prodigious pace south and west. If its homing instinct led it upon the right line, there can be no doubt that somewhere out in the wastes of the Atlantic that last European pterodactyl found its end. One more little scene, and I have done. Last night we all supped at Lord John Roxton's rooms, and sitting together afterwards we smoked in good comradeship and talked our adventures over. It was strange under these altered surroundings to see the old well-known faces and figures. There was Challenger, with his smile of condescension, his drooping eyelids, his intolerant eyes, his aggressive beard, his huge chest, swelling and puffing as he laid down the law to Summerlee. And Summerlee, too, there he was with his short briar between his thin moustache and his grey goat's beard. His worn face protruded in eager debate as he queried all Challenger's propositions. Finally, there was our host, with his rugged eagle face and his cold blue glacier eyes, with always a shimmer of devilment and of humour down in the depths of them. Such is the last picture of them that I have carried away. It was after supper in his own sanctum that Lord John Roxton had something to say to us. From a table he had brought an old cigar-box, and this he laid before him on the table. "There's one thing," said he, "that maybe I should have spoken about before this, but I wanted to know a little more clearly where I was. No use to raise hopes and let them down again. But it's facts, not hopes, with us now. You may remember that day we found the pterodactyl rookery in the swamp, what? Well, something in the lie of the land took my notice. Perhaps it has escaped you, so I will tell you. It was a volcanic vent full of blue clay." The professors nodded. "Well now, in the whole world I've only had to do with one place that was a volcanic vent of blue clay. That was the Great De Beers diamond mine of Kimberley, what? So you see, I got diamonds into my head. I rigged up a contraption to hold off those stinking birds, and I spent a happy day there with a spud. This is what I got." He opened his cigar-box, and tilting it over, he poured about 20 or 30 rough stones, varying from the size of beans to that of chestnuts, on the table. "Perhaps you think I should have told you then. Well, so I should, only I know there are a lot of traps for the unwary, and that stones may be of any size, and yet of little value where colour and consistency are clean off. Therefore I brought them back, and on the first day at home I took one round to Spinks, and asked him to have it roughly cut and valued." He took a pillbox from his pocket, and spilled out of it a beautiful glittering diamond, one of the finest stones that I have ever seen. "That's the result," said he. "He prices the lot at a minimum of £200,000. Of course, it is fair shares between us. I won't hear of anything else. Well, Challenger, what will you do with your 50,000? "If you really persist in your generous view," said the professor, "I should found a private museum, which has long been one of my dreams." "And you, Summerlee?" "I would retire from teaching, and so find time for my classification of the chalk fossils." "I'll use my own," said Lord John Roxton, "in fitting a well-formed expedition and having another look at the dear old plateau. As to you, young fella, you of course will spend yours getting married." "Not just yet," said I, with a rueful smile. "I think, if you will have me, that I would rather go with you." Lord Roxton said nothing, but a brown hand was stretched out to me across the table.